Olá a todas e todos, eu sou o Pedro Charbel e estou aqui hoje com Arturo Hartmann, coordenador internacional do Brasil de Fato. Essa é uma parceria da Fundação Lauro Campos com o Brasil de Fato, integrando aqui esse nosso projeto de discutir temas importantes que têm a ver com as lutas que a gente trava aqui no Brasil e no mundo. E hoje a gente tem um convidado muito especial, Jeremy Corbyn, membro do Parlamento do Reino Unido, que foi líder do Partido Trabalhista, está aqui conosco, veio acompanhar as eleições no Brasil. Felizmente, celebramos hoje a vitória de Lula e vamos conversar um pouco com ele sobre esse contexto e outras questões importantes da nossa atualidade. Jeremy, thank you very much for being here with us in this historical moment. This is, as you know, the most important election of our lives. So I want to start asking you two questions. How do you see Lula's victory's impact on the left around the world for progressive forces? And on the other hand, how is the extreme right-wing organizing? How would you consider the similarities and differences between what you saw in Brazil from the extreme right-wing here and the right-wing in Europe and the US? What can we expect of this multipolar world now with Lula elected?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to have this discussion with you today. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's been a great learning exercise for me to meet so many people from the left in Brazil, and indeed from all over Latin America over the last 3 days. I'm sad there aren't more people here from Europe. There are very, very small delegations from Europe here for this election, which I think is a shame. And I think they should take the situation in Brazil more seriously. It's interesting that you said this is the most important of our election of our lifetime after the election. Most people only ever say that before the election and never repeat it again. You're right. It is a highly significant election. Yes, Lula won by a very small margin in percentage terms, 1% or a bit less, but in vote terms, 2 million, which is huge. In European terms, that's a huge majority. And that victory was achieved with absolutely every possible thing stacked against him. He was less than 3 years ago in prison, indicted on completely false charges of corruption, and was freed because of solidarity campaigns, because of legal action, and because of the determination of the Brazilian people. The solidarity was huge in Brazil, quite a lot over much of Latin America, not much in Europe, not much was said. I sent many statements of support to Lula when I was leader of the Labour Party on behalf of the Labour Party. I don't think many other parties did anything like as much as they could and should have done. They didn't understand the seriousness of how fake news, false information can gain legs and destroy an individual's character. But thank you to Jeffrey Robertson and John Watts and many, many others in the legal team were able to use international law against those that jailed Lula. And that was significant and important. So Lula eventually out, fights back for the election, and narrowly wins against a very well-funded, very powerful Bolsonaro campaign with all the prejudices at his command, homophobia, racism, sexism, misogyny, and destruction of the natural world and destruction of the lives of so many poor people. But what was interesting was that in my observation, the message that Lula was giving in the last few days of the campaign that I was listening to very carefully was one of working class solidarity, was of the fundamentals of the campaign, which is about housing, food, shelter, environment, world peace, all the issues that Lula spoke about in the campaign. It wasn't trying to appeal to the right or to the triangulate in the way that European social democrats usually do. So I think it's a victory for socialist organization at the grassroots. Now, I'm sure there's going to be difficult days ahead, inevitably. There isn't a majority in Congress. There isn't a majority in the Senate. There's a lot of governors who are against him. So it's a mandate at the top. It's a mandate at the bottom. He's got a big group of political forces in between who are quite hostile to him. That's going to be hard to manage. The lesson is quite simply this, that a country like Brazil that has an image of being one of incredible wealth and incredible poverty, of meritocratic wealth on the basis of investment, exploitation, business development, and so on, has been defeated. And the image that is now there of Brazil is of a community of demand to achieve degrees of social justice. So I listened very carefully, and I was there last night when President-elect Lula came to speak, to accept the election result. And I thought it was a truly remarkable speech. And some of the lines in it were very powerful when he said, Brazil produces much food for the world. It does, soya and so much else. Yet the children are going hungry. And he then talked about the environmental destruction. Now, Bolsonaro's legacy has been that you can chop down every tree, you can take up every shrub, you can destroy the rainforests, you'll grow more soy, you'll make more money to grow more soy, and you'll make more money and grow more soya. It's completely madness. It doesn't work like that. That whole argument has been defeated in favor of sustainability. And so I thought his clear declaration, not just about the Amazon, which will be very well received by the left all over the world and every environmentalist all over the world, was about sustainable agriculture and sustainable future for Brazil. And his clear denunciation of racism, his support for refugees and migrant people who are going through such hell on this earth at the moment was wonderful. And the last part, you asked about the international issues surrounding this. I think they're very significant. Now, the war in Ukraine is raging. Russia is totally wrong to invade and try and occupy Ukraine. So that's absolutely clear. It's also clear that this war can only get worse the longer it goes on. More and more armaments are going to be pumped in on both sides. More and more Ukrainian people are either going to exile or be killed. More and more Russian conscripts will die. And the world's food supply, gas supplies, fertilizer supplies, and everything else will be continuously disrupted. At some point, there has to be a process. And I thought Lula's remarks, without making any commitment, that Brazil did not wish to be part of a Cold War and would work with the USA, with Russia, with China, with India, with the rest of the world to try and reduce tensions and not to descend into another Cold War. A major leader in a huge and very important country saying that is of huge significance. And I hope that President Lula is able to work so well with other Latin American leaders, with AMLO, with Boric, with Petro, to try and create that greater sense of Latin American unity, but also an economic unity, which is about internal development and growth in Latin America, rather than the model, which is a colonial model of an exploitative, extractive economies, which every country in Latin America has at the present time. So I think this is a moment of enormous satisfaction and joy, and it's been to me an unbelievable pleasure to be here with Progressive International, meeting good people like yourselves and learning so much from this visit. I go home a much better informed and educated person. I first came to Sao Paulo, by the way, when I was 19 years old.
Oh.
And
quite
a
lot changed since then.
Well, when I was 19 in Sao Paulo, how should I put it? The football was great. I went to football matches and I loved it. The music was great and I loved it. However, the police were not nice. And it was a military dictatorship at that time. And I probably unwisely, because when you're 19, you're not very wise, joined in every demonstration I saw. It wasn't clever, but there you go. I survived.
Yeah, discussing football is something that could take some time.
So
especially now during starting the World Cup.
Well, my football is heavily centered on Arsenal and Forest Green Rovers. So.
Mr. Corbyn, I would like to go back to a question that Pedro touched about the organization of the extreme far right.
Yeah.
Because Lula won, but Bolsonaro had a lot of votes, right? And we could actually
50 million votes.
We should think and see how Brazil fits into that and the legacy that Bolsonaro will leave to Brazilian politics. But I want to go further a little bit, and we can talk about how do you see this position in the war. We have midterms in the U.S. soon, and Trump's still a powerful figure in American politics. Tomorrow we have elections in Israel, and we have the possibility of having Netanyahu coming back to power. So how do you see, talking about Europe, this organization, the consolidation of extreme far-right politicians, like in Italy, for example, we had recently?
I'm a member of the Council of Europe as part of the British parliamentary delegation. It's an all-party delegation. And I was shocked at the last session of the Council of Europe. This is not the European Union, it's the Council of Europe. It's all states in Europe, with the exception of Belarus and Russia, send parliamentary delegations to it. So it's quite interesting. And it also is the guardian of the European Convention of Human Rights, and it appoints judges to the European Court of Human Rights. So it's of importance and significance. For the first time, we had the new far-right deputies from Italy came. I'm a member of the Migration Committee. We were trying to get a report through which was condemning illegal pushbacks of refugees by Greece and by other countries, Britain as well. We got it through eventually. We got the decisions that we wanted with great difficulty. But we saw what is happening politically now represented there, of the rise of the far right in Italy and in Hungary in particular, but also the growth of the racist right in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, Germany, and Britain. And so there is an organized group of the far right. They're using this time refugees as the scapegoat. In the same way, the far right used Jewish people as a scapegoat in the 1920s when the Nazis came to power in Germany. The refugees are the new victims. The left parties have, I'm being generous here, a mixed record on this. The Social Democrats in Denmark, whilst many of their social programs, their housing, transport, environmental policies are very good, fine, their attitude towards migration, to refugees, is quite appalling. And that is an argument that extends all the way through the social democratic parties in Europe. Do they triangulate to play into the hands of racists in order to retain perceived support of a perception that working class communities do not want diversity or migration within them? Or do you do something different? And you recognize that refugees are victims, and that any society that tolerates racism, at the end of the day, becomes a racist society and weakens itself. And so in Britain, the movement against the government's new austerity policy and economic strategy of redistribution of wealth to the wealthiest is being strongly opposed. But the opposition to it is not just economic, it's political, it's by trade unions, it's by social movements, very like the coalition that put Lula into the presidency is a coalition of those forces. And next Saturday in London, the 5th of November, we're having a very big demonstration of the Enough is Enough campaign, the People's Assembly, all the trade unions, the rail workers, postal workers, teachers, health workers, and many others who are in dispute at the present time, in unity together. anti-racist campaigns marching there as well. And 4 weeks ago, I was at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool, and there's been a strike at the Liverpool docks. I went to address a rally of striking dock workers. I was personally very well received by them. And when I called for solidarity with refugees and migrant people, I was supported. I was supported by striking dock workers and seafarers because they see something of themselves in all of this. And it's that unity we've got to develop. If the left, in its broadest sense, thinks you can appease racism, appease the far right, give them space in order that somehow or other you can triangulate and win through, you don't. There can be no compromise with the far right. There can be no compromise with racism. And that's why I was interested, not just in what Lula said last night about racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, and frankly, a very high level of institutional racism in every Brazilian institution, and it's there, you can see it, that he was very well received on that. So this seems to me like a very good start to the new administration that will confront those social issues by campaigning, by solidarity, and by education.
And going back a little bit, you already mentioned the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. If you could say, for example, so you have economic problems with food and fuel regarding mm-hmm. the war in Ukraine. But if you could elaborate a little more on the discussion, because I think the war brought some dilemmas. Mm-hmm. You had a political discussion, which is the role of NATO over Europe, but also to elaborate a new discourse, a new narrative of peace. And I'm talking about the left, how the left could, what is, in the end, I'm asking you, the impacts. We are reaching almost 9 months of the war in Ukraine. What are the impacts of the war over the left in Europe?
The impact has been economic, it's been political, it's been social. There's a very large number of Ukrainian refugees all over Western Europe, mainly Poland, Romania, and Germany, some in France and some in Britain, but not that many. The political approach has been welcoming them, which is good. There are many Ukrainian refugees living in my own community. I've been meeting them, working with them, and people are very supportive of them. Sadly, Ukrainian refugees are welcomed at the airport. If you arrive at London Airport tomorrow, there'll be somebody there with a Ukrainian flag saying, "Any Ukrainians welcome here." If you're a Yemeni person arriving to the war in Yemen, if you're a Palestinian arriving because your home had been bombed in Gaza, there's nobody there to welcome you for that. And so there is a difference in approach. So there's a social lesson there. The second one is that a lot of people didn't believe that Russia would invade Ukraine. I must say, I didn't. I assumed that this massive military exercise on the border was just some kind of virility symbol by Putin and the others, that they could do a bit of parading around and show how big and strong they were. And so when they then went in to occupy Donetsk and Luhansk, not very surprising. There's been a terrible fighting going on there for 5 years now. But then when it went further than that, there was a kind of shock and horror about it. And just to repeat, I think Russia is completely wrong. And Russia could and should have come to an accommodation with Ukraine. But where was the UN when the invasion took place? Wasn't that the time for Antonio Guterres to go immediately to Moscow and to Kiev? Wasn't it that's the time to say, look, hang on, we've got to come to some deal here? And I think the argument for the left has to be that we've got to look for peace. Otherwise, what are we going to do? Just pump weapons into a war, which inevitably at some point will go beyond Ukraine. NATO is not a member of Ukraine. Sorry, Ukraine is not a member of NATO at the moment, has applied for membership, and I'm sure it would be granted. That means you've got a NATO-Russia border, as you have a NATO-Russia border in the Baltic states as well, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That is very dangerous. If the West builds up arms and weapons on the borders of Russia, then the military and the arms industry in Russia will build up weapons and arms on the border of Russia. That's how it works in a Cold War. And the development of the Cold War against China by the AUKUS Pact, the Australia-UK-US Pact, which is a nuclear pact as well, will increase tensions with China, who will then spend more on arms. So at a time when the world is trying to get out of the pandemic, when it's got an environmental disaster on its hands, when it's got an inequality disaster on its hands, got a poverty disaster on its hand, Britain is proposed to spend 3% of GDP on weapons. In other words, a 50% increase in arms expenditure in a country that desperately needs to do something about levels of poverty. So I think the left argument has to be, Russia is wrong. The US was wrong to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. One country should not invade another and certainly shouldn't occupy another. And so it has to be somebody else trying to bring about a peace process. And I hope that with the mandate and the experience he has, President Lula in the BRICS coalition, which is a politically very odd coalition, but nevertheless it's there, it's an alternative structure, maybe his presence and that of AMLO and others from Latin America will be able to start some kind of process. I hope so.
Jeremy, I want to go back to what you were mentioning about the new challenges in organizing workers. You mentioned how migrants and refugees are often put, sometimes the left isn't that people can relate to these causes, and they're put in some sort of antagonism among workers. But we are also seeing a change of the type of workers. Yeah. So informal workers, Uber workers, the whole more precarious labor situation around the world. That's a global process. We've been facing challenges to organize among those workers and get them engaged. And many of them have supported even Bolsonaro and are supporting other right-wing initiatives. How do you see that in the UK and internationally speaking? And what could be the path for the left to understand that we no longer can rely only on unions and organized traditional social movements, but we need to perhaps rebuild our strategies going more territorial, grassroots, to get to these people and dispute their hearts and minds?
We have a situation where technology, economic imperatives, and wealth creation have changed enormously into, in many cases, a virtual economy, a gig economy, a service economy, and the biggest growth in the jobs is actually in service areas rather than in manufacturing. Trade unions are usually, not always, but usually organized around industrial structures that barely exist anymore. And union membership, generally speaking, is older rather than younger. And young workers in the gig economy and service economy don't see a union at their doorstep, don't relate to a union because they don't know what it is. They haven't grown up with that culture and that tradition. And so the left has to recognize that, one, unions have got to change, and very fast, and got to take into membership people who are self-employed, people who are individually employed, people that are employed in platform companies that maybe only have 6 or 8 people in a particular location, and bring them into union membership, but have a community-based membership where it's membership for life rather than for your job. And the PT at its best was that, actually, at its very best when its foundation. I'm thinking back to Porto Alegre times and so on. I think it's that model that we have to look at. Now, in Britain, union membership, it has gone up and is continuing to rise, mainly in the service sector. But interestingly, in the gig economy, which is essentially delivery riders and others, but there are other groups as well, it's often the new unions like United Voices of the World, International Workers of the World, that are getting the members, not necessarily the older, more structured unions, although they're now waking up to the fact they've got to expand their activities and their membership. And so we're going through a period of union growth in Britain. And for example, I strongly support the rail workers in their demand for decent pay and conditions, and also their demand that the work not be contracted out and subcontracted, but brought in-house within Network Rail, which is publicly owned, which owns the rail system, or the train operating companies which operate the services. And so I did an appeal 2 days ago in support of the cleaners on the railways in Britain, none of whom were employed by the train operating companies or by Network Rail, but employed by companies that subcontract the work. They are appallingly treated, very badly paid, often migrant women mainly, often Latin American, Colombian women particularly, and Bolivian women particularly, that do this work. They, however, have got themselves organized into unions, into the Rail, Maritime and Transport, into other unions as well. And so to say it's all over, it's not. Union membership is growing, and that sense of solidarity with it. So I'm very hopeful of the growth of political trade unionism and political action being taken by unions. Most unions in Britain were affiliated to the Labour Party, and many still are, but the Labour Party has to represent those interests, and the idea that Labour MPs shouldn't be seen taking part in industrial disputes is ludicrous. Surely that's what the duty of a socialist MP is.
Yeah. Oh, Jeremy, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we need to end. We have a short amount of time.
Can I just say something? I just say something? First of all, thank you very much for your time and for the work that the left has done in Brazil and the hardships, the villainization you've been through from the media and so much else. And we've been showing the film The Coup by Victor Fraga and others. We've been showing it at cinemas in my area with a discussion that follows, and it's educated a lot of people about the reality of what goes on. You have our support and our solidarity, and we're inspired by your achievements. You know what? Across the water, working together, we can achieve a lot.
Yes.
Let's make sure we do.
Yes. They are working together. We must work together. It's
Absolutely.
A global struggle, or our struggle must be international. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, Arturo. Lembrar a todas e todos que acompanhem, portanto, o canal da Fundação Lauro Campos Marielle Franco, as redes do Brasil de Fato. Sigam nossa página, acompanham mais entrevistas como essa. O Luta Sem Fronteiras acontece 2 vezes ao mês e o Brasil de Fato está com uma programação também constante, acompanhando temas internacionais e debates importantes da nossa atualidade.